Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone, and welcome to the show. It's so hard to believe I've been doing that for over 6 years as my intro to the show, both from when I was on broadcast radio and the year and a half that I've been doing the show live stream. It's become my catchphrase, as they say, and having been and still am a huge The Big Bang Theory fan, I still get comparisons from fans of the show, from listeners of the show saying, welcome. You're kind of like Sheldon, where he has to knock 3 times. And I say it because I truly am excited to always be here with all of you every week to get to share my incredible guests, to share a bit of my own story, and to introduce you to a new way of thinking, which is asking the right questions. Now, throughout the show, for those of you who may be just joining for the very first time, the whole goal of my show is to introduce you to perception shifting ideas from guests that have had extraordinary lives. They have different ways of thinking, but I'm just gonna ask them questions about, in some cases, like my current guest, Joe Serio, his latest book, My Life in Moscow, Vodka Hookers and the Russian Mafia. You are just going to be in for a ride when you read this book, which is based on, well, it is the true story of what happened to him while he was doing work investigating the Russian Mafia and living life in Moscow. So we're going to get to talk to him about that. You're listening to the show, you may want to take notes, you may not. The beauty of it is I'm doing it live stream right now, but you get to listen to it on the podcast. And thanks to all of you, my fans, the show is in the top 5% worldwide of all podcasts. So thank you for that. And let's dive right in right now and bring to you my guest, my friend, just somebody who is truly amazing. And we met over a hug. I'd like to introduce you all to my friend, Joe Serio.
Hello. Welcome.
Thank you. And, everybody always asks me, well, how did you meet this person that you're having on the show? And ours is a very unique story. We met because of a hug. Do you want to share that?
We did. I was in California for a conference, and to make a long story short, it just so happened that I saw this woman standing at the door, the standing guard to make sure nobody got into the ballroom before they were allowed, except she had a smile on her face. And the thing about me is people that smile readily catch my eye. They attract my attention. People with friendly faces attract my attention. And Laura was just standing there beaming, welcoming everybody, and I gave her a hug. So I want to flesh out this story a little bit because it becomes important to the conversation we're about to have. And part of the important part of the conversation is how things are connected, how things are strangely interconnected in a lot of ways we don't realize. So Laura and I met. Then I went to Florida to visit her. We had lunch on the water. That was lovely. And we, over time, kept talking and realized that 35 years earlier,
I forgot about that day.
my sisters on Long Island in New York, where I grew up, my family, my two sisters who played guitar at the church masses played at the wedding of Laura's cousin, if I have that right.
Yeah, my cousin
And
Nancy Ellen.
and that was totally, we stumbled onto that fact. Laura did not grow up in New York. I did not know her 35 years ago. Our families didn't know each other.
No, I grew up in New York.
Did you? Where were you?
Yeah. I grew up in the Bronx and Yonkers, New York, and
Okay,
I had family on Long Island, and
Right, but none of those lines intersected 35, 40
none
years
of
ago.
my lines with yours, right?
Right. And your cousin's family and my family, I don't think we knew each other. We kind of knew of each other, maybe. I think they knew of us, but
Yeah. Well, some of your brothers or sisters went to school with my
right,
cousins,
right.
and then I called my aunt, And I said, I'm sitting here with Joe Serio. And she's like, oh, I know the Serio family.
Well, it was hard not to know us since there were 14 of us.
Right.
There are 12 kids and mom and dad. It was hard not to know at least who we were.
Right.
Um, but you and I didn't have any connection, and I didn't have
No.
any connection with that family. And it took taking a random trip to California, popping up in this conference and seeing you at the door. And if you didn't have a smile on your face, I would have walked right past you.
And then we proceeded every single time because I was helping my friend Audrey Hagen, who runs massive events. She's like, hey, Laura, can you help me behind the scenes? And I'm like, well, okay, sure. So I flew out to California, put the headset on, and the whole mic pack for when you're behind a huge event. And she's like, hey, could you just like man the doors? And I had so much fun greeting people. And you made a point because there were a couple of doors going into the room. You made a point every single time after that of finding the door I was on.
It was fun. It was
Wow,
fun.
and we've had a friendship for years now, and I
Yep,
think I own every book you've written, and I have
fantastic.
autographed copies of all of them, and I would have pulled out all the other ones to show you, except based on a situation I had upstairs in my house, all of books are in boxes put away as I'm redoing it. But this one, your latest one, Vodka Hookers and the Russian Mafia, and everybody, this is an incredible, incredible book. And the reason you're not seeing this copy dog-eared is because I had the privilege of reading this book throughout. As Joe would send me chapters and stories of this book, and I don't want to dog ear this copy because it just means so much to me. uh, you talked about connections, Joe, and how things relate, and this book is very much about these random moments that seem random but really aren't. Some people would call them God incidences, some people would call them coincidences, whatever. But your life, I mean, I know how it happened. Can you share with my audience how you ended up in Moscow dealing with, highest levels of groups in Moscow inside the government that, KGB, whatever you want to call those folks over there that scare the heck out of us, right? And dealing with Russian mafia and some US kind of stuff that you were
Yeah,
just on. Oh, God, I can't think of the name of the show.
48 hours.
48 Hours that you were
Yeah.
just on and interviewed for because of this. So I'm
Yeah,
giving
and
you the mic. Go for it.
that that's another we'll get to that story. That's another crazy intersection of lines and connections over time and space. So the beginning is when I was a sophomore in college, I closed my eyes, opened up the course catalog for the classes in school.
You did
I
one of those.
twirled my finger in the air and just slammed it down on the paper, and the finger landed on a class called Who Are the Soviets? I had no, I don't have any Russian blood. I wasn't a kid who grew up and said, I must read Russian literature in the original Russian. Like, that's not me at all. But I took the class, and it was Russian politics, literature, culture, and it was really neat. I mean, it was really interesting and fascinating. And my father said, if you want to have any chance of understanding these people, you should start studying Russian language right now. And that was sophomore, junior year. And I was too stupid to understand that that was going to be really difficult. So I started and I got hooked. And it was the only thing that I studied right in college. Studying right means I did it almost every single day. And if you study music or language, things like that, you have to do it every day. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And I did it, and I got hooked, and I ended up going to Russian summer school at Bryn Mawr College outside Philadelphia. One summer, I went to Norwich Military Academy in Vermont for one summer. And it was the kind of place where you stand up and say, I promise not to speak English for the next 8 weeks. And everything, classes, exams, extracurricular, everything was in Russian. So I dived in at the deep end, and got hooked. And then when college was over, I went to Moscow for 6 months and studied at a language school there. And that's how the ball got rolling. Then I met somebody, and this is one of those, whatever you want to call them, right? Intersections, coincidences, not such a coincidence. I met somebody who had been a detective in the NYPD. He got his PhD. He became the vice president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. He then became the vice chancellor of the University of Illinois at Chicago. And his boss said, "Hey, I know you're interested in international things. Here's whatever sum of money, $20,000 or something. Go set up relationships around the world." And he set up relationships with Chinese police and Israeli police, Egyptian police, Chilean police, all over the place, but not Russian. So my first year working for him, he said, "Okay, I'm going to send you to China for 6 months." Okay, good deal. I'm not going to argue with you.
Okay,
Excellent.
let's just step back one step
Yeah.
and give a time frame, because the way, Russia was back then and
Yeah.
now
Yes.
is a bit different. So nobody should be thinking of this in terms of the 2000s.
Right. This is 1987. Is 1986 was the first time I went to the Soviet Union. So I went for a tour for 3 months, and then in 1987, I studied there for 6 months. I moved to Chicago to work for the vice chancellor in September of 1987. He sent me to China in 1988. And then by the time I got back from China, he had gone to the Soviet Union and developed relationships with the Soviet police. And asked me one day, after the organized crime control department of the Soviet National Police had sent two of their colonels to Chicago. My boss says to me, "How would you like to go work in Soviet National Police headquarters for 4 months with these cops?" And I said no. And he said,
I
"What are
don't
you?"
blame you.
He said, "What are you talking about?" No. I said, "Well, I've been watching you. You're a bit of a wheeler dealer. I haven't been to Moscow in 2.5 years, 3 years. I haven't spoken Russian in 3 years. So if you send me for a year, I'll do it." And so he's like, "All right, tough guy. Great. You're going for a year." So he sent me over there. It ended up being about 9 or 10 months. And I had a desk in the organized crime control department of the Soviet National Police at a time when Gorbachev had come into power 2 years earlier, 3 years earlier. The Soviet Union was collapsing. The Russian Mafia was on the rise. It was starting to take over the country in every sense of the word. And here I was, 3 years old, 23, 24 years old, sitting in Moscow, uh, having my eyes ripped wide open from my naive Long Island upbringing and kind of sheltered and protected, to see, kind of how the world works, especially kind of the world in extremis almost at that point for a normal, first worldish country to be going through collapse. It was pretty dramatic. And one day, just as a quick example, I'm in my supervisor's office. My supervisor was the deputy chief of organized crime control. There's a bang on the door, and the door flies open before he says, "Come in." One of his agents comes rushing into the room, stops in the middle of the room, looks at me, says to the supervisor, "Can I talk in front of him?" He says, "Yes." And the agent says, "We just learned that Ivanovich, who's going to be in this meeting in 15 minutes with you and the deputy minister of the internal affairs, is connected to the mafia." At that moment, I was kind of in shock, holding my breath. It's like, what are you talking? Like, this is National Police Headquarters. You guys are colonels and generals, and you're running the organized crime control department. What do you mean this guy is part of mafia? And and Gennady, my supervisor, just kind of sat back and stuck his fingers on the bridge of his nose and basically, kind of whispered an expletive under his breath. And And that was it. And what I realized was mafia wasn't really mafia the way I thought of it. It wasn't five Italian families in New York City. It wasn't structured groups. It was just kind of everywhere. It was just a mafia state of mind in the whole country, which it took me some time to figure that out, but that's what ended up happening.
I mean, that, as I read the book, right, knowing time and space and place of where a number of these stories were told, that, you actually lived through, like the one you just talked about, and then putting it in a current year state of brain of 2021, I feel like nothing's changed in terms of what the average American, average world person sort of knows about these inner workings. And yet somehow the Russian mafia has become even more powerful, more intertwined from the outside looking in with the government there. With, it sure seems like governments here must be okay with it, because they can't seem to control it like they did the Italian mafia, that everybody kind of knew who they were in New York. You'd go down to Arthur Avenue and the mob owned this and the mob owned that, but the mob kept the neighborhoods pretty dang nice and took care of the people. These new mobs, the Russian mob, you were in China, so you've got the Yakuza, is
Oh, that's
that
Japanese.
Japanese?
Mhm.
But China's got its own, and you've got all that. It just feels like the mob is different than what it used to be. I mean, when you're living there in Russia and you're still got stuff going on, I'm sure now that you don't even want to talk about, I don't know how you could have lived there with an American mentality and dealt with all of this.
Yeah, well, very quickly you found out that an American mentality wasn't very useful over there, right? And so in 1986 and 87, when I was studying over there, just take simple things. We can get to the mafia concept in a second, but it helps to start at the grassroots. And that is in 1987, I did things like bribe my way into empty restaurants. Okay, so you had you had to pay every step of the way. I can't tell you how many cops I've bribed when I was over there, just on traffic stops. Um, the waiters in the restaurants would lock the door from the inside and keep it locked. And we'd bang on the door. They open the door just a little bit to talk to us, and they'd say 10 rubles. It's like, what do you mean 10 rubles? Yeah, 10 rubles to let you in. And I look over his shoulder. The restaurant is empty. And my mentality is, you're going to open a restaurant to make money. Their mentality is, the state owns this restaurant along with everything else. We don't care if anybody comes in. We're still going to make our 200, 300 rubles a month. But if you want to get in here, you pay us 10 rubles. We'll split that with the wait staff and our friends and all that, and then we'll let you in. But if you don't want to pay the 10 rubles, we don't care. And this concept of the gatekeeper, who has control over what? And if you're powerful enough to be positioned in a gatekeeper spot, then you get to you get to say who gets in and who doesn't get in. Well, guess what? The entire country works like that. And over time, I came to realize that it's not just the restaurant, it's not just the cop, it's the system. It's the system from top to bottom. And when I wrote my first book on the Russian Mafia about 12 years ago, called Investigating the Russian Mafia, when I was doing the research for that book, I came to realize that the people and the situations I ran into in the 1990s were the same situations that Russia had 500 years ago. This is a cultural space. This is a psychological way of being. This is a power game writ large. This is about relationships and negotiation. This is not about democracy. This is not about rule of law. This is about power game. And that's what Russia is, as far as I'm concerned, in my perspective. The corruption, the black markets, the counterfeiting goods, the murder, mayhem, whatever. That's not new. That did not start in the 1990s because of the Russian mafia. Russia is a dog eat dog world, period, at
So it
every
was like that.
level.
And just going to interrupt you a second. It was
Yeah.
like that before the communism came in. It was like that when they had, the oligarchies and everything there.
It's been like that for hundreds of years. The friend of mine was the head of Interpol for Russia, right? So every country has its own Interpol office. My friend was the head of the Interpol office for Russia. And he said, I don't understand what the big deal is. It's just that you're finally finding out what we're like. It's like the West is just finally understanding what we are. That's what we are.
I you
It's
know, I
staggering. It's
I've
staggering,
read
isn't
it.
it?
Okay, I just read this book multiple times, in every iteration from start to finish. And I'm still stuck in my mindset of fairness, of not dog eat dog, of try to give everybody opportunity, try to whatever. It's not a democratic thinking. It's just a fine. I'll say the word. It's a moral way of thinking. But what you describe and what you talk about of that Russia, you're saying for hundreds and hundreds of years, and your friend at Interpol is really that dog eat dog, that we're all in it for ourselves mentality. And I help me wrap my head around that, Joe. How did you shift? I mean, was there a moment that you finally got this?
I'm sure there are many moments. So the thing is that it's when you go into a new culture, right? Let's use prison culture. If you go into a new culture, you have to understand what the codes are. What's the code? What's the language mean? Who's the boss? How are we going to maneuver around each other? It's the same thing going into any culture. So
But
going
even the
into,
American culture, you have to
of
understand that.
course,
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
And the American culture is easy for people from places like Russia, China, Nigeria, even parts of Europe. American culture is kind of easy to understand in that it's all on the surface. So people who are used to scamming and deception and maneuvering and manipulating in order to get what they want, in order to get basic food, goods, and services, then coming here is an easy deal. Going there is more difficult. So I'll give you a quick example. In 1990, I was working in the headquarters, National Police headquarters. I went to the the Moscow bureau of the Chicago Tribune. I was living in Chicago at the time. I said, let me go talk to them and I'll see if they have files on Russian mafia, whatever. They can open up their files to me. Turns out at that point, they, like most of the world, were not following the Russian mafia that closely. But the journalist there introduced me to his office manager. Okay. His office manager is Russian. So let me just lay this out for you and just think about it from an American mentality. The office manager is Russian. He has a job at a foreign newspaper. He speaks English really well. He's very personable and has a good sense of humor. And our American mentality would say, oh, good for him. He's developing a career. He got an opportunity to work with foreigners. He studied so hard, speaks English really well. He's a very nice guy, right? At least my naive, protected American slash Long Island mentality says, oh, wow, what a nice fellow. And he's successful.
Right.
And my Russian side says, he's KGB, period. Okay.
Because the only way he would get where he is if he was KGB.
So the first meeting we had, I'm listening to him. His English is almost flawless. He tells me that he served in the military, but not only that, he traveled overseas. Not only that, he was the aide de camp of a general in the Soviet army. Not only that, he had opportunities that other people didn't have. Not only that, his mother worked in the state planning agency, which all are little pieces. They're little chips, right? And I talk a lot about kaleidoscope in the book. All these little pieces of colored glass that make up the picture. And then when we turn that kaleidoscope, the picture gets confused and puzzling and everything else. When I finished talking to that guy for the first time, I knew he was KGB. And he showed me his KGB credentials. Uh, when was it? 18 years later. He
18 years.
18 years later, when I was back in Moscow for a quick trip, he I guess he kind of like was surprising me, and it's like, hey, look at this. I'm in KGB, and I was like, dude, yeah, I know. you know, I've known since the day I met you. But I liked him a lot. So we stayed friends, and we actually worked together quite closely for a long time because he was really good at his job, and he was really good at accessing information. But that's the code, right? So let me connect back to the prison for a second, and then I'll shut up.
Okay.
The prison idea is not just a frivolous one to talk about in passing in terms of codes. Soviets had a prison mentality. They had language. They called the big prison the big zone. Prison's called zone in slang. The big zone and the small zone. The small zone were the real prisons, as you and I understand. The big zone was the country.
Oh,
The country was the prison. You can't get out easily. You need special permission. The ruble is not a real currency. It's just like a prison chit, something to use to get things out of the prison commissary. The state could change the value of anything they wanted at any time. They could change your sentence. They could do anything they wanted to you as a citizen, not inside prison, as a citizen. So you walk into the store, and an American mentality in 1990s and 2000s, you walk into the store, you're going to find anything you want. You walk into a store in the Soviet Union in the 80s and 90s, the likelihood was you weren't going to find what you wanted. And if you found it today, it's not going to be there in 3 days because supply and demand work differently over there. So that you have this mentality of, I must fight for everything. I must have relationships to find what we need to survive. When I came back from 6 months in Moscow, just 6 months in 1987, I went to a US supermarket. I stood in the cereal aisle and I almost cried. And I walked out with nothing in my hands because it was too confusing to make a choice. Because for 6 months, I was, oh, I hope they have this. Oh, I hope I can find some fruit in the store, which I usually didn't. Oh, I hope there's some milk. Oh, I hope. And it's just this mentality was totally, and that was 6 months. Now, what do you do with a lifetime or a 500-year, 1,000-year culture of that kind of thinking? It sets us up for scam and deception and manipulating. And my buddy said, in terms of corruption, we get this with our mother's milk. We understand by the time we're 8 or 9 years old that we have to play games to get what we want.
so basically, the country created the Russian Mafia as it was. They're like the hierarchy, the monarchy of the citizenry, because these are the people that have learned how to get everything that they need, and they're setting a lot of the terms now. Not even the government, but I'm thinking the government has said, oh yeah, we like you here doing whatever because we're getting something from you as well. Is that the way my brain should be going with what you're talking about, or is it
So
incorrect thinking?
no, you're heading in the right direction. So every mafia grows out of its culture, right? So our mafia our everything, our prisons, our whatever, are kind of a joke to Russians. Well, I did some films for A&E investigative reports, and one of the films we went inside Russian prison, and one of the inmates said, "Yeah, fine. You want to arrest me in the United States and put me in prison? Fine. That's a joke compared to our prisons. Our mafia, you're a joke compared to our mafia. We're we grew up in this mentality of constant, like we were just saying, right? Manipulation, corruption, scandal, relationships, negotiation. That's what we did on a daily basis. But it's not just the mafia that became the monarchy or whatever you want to call it. They weren't the only ones doing it. So there was a vast illegal black market underworld network of people who weren't necessarily gangsters. They would have been called businessmen in our country, but
Okay.
business was illegal, right? So everything became illegal. So, we talk about asking questions. It's all about the questions. The question for me became, what does illegal and legal mean? What does immoral and moral mean? What do they mean after being in this environment? If I followed a strictly American way of life in Russia, in the Soviet Union, in the 1980s, 1990s, I'm not so sure I would have survived.
It sounds like you wouldn't have gotten food
Yeah,
or a
just,
place to live or
yes.
electricity or whatever you needed for basics of survival.
Everything that I got over there as an American came through my relationships. Every apartment I got, I didn't look up the newspaper or get online and say, "Oh, let me find an apartment." And as an independent entity, I could go live. I found, is it possible? Of course it's possible, but you need insulation. And the insulation are the contacts. And I want to do things through as many contacts and the closest contacts I have as possible. Why? The mentality of the place. Thinking about this, 11 time zones. This place dwarfs virtually every other country in the world. 11 time zones with people that experience the KGB, informants everywhere, the Gulag labor camps, family and friends who were taken in the middle of the night. When I was there in 86, 87, when I went to visit friends in their apartments, they would say, "Don't speak English, don't talk on the stairways until you get into the apartment and the apartment door is closed and locked, and then you can talk." And then we would sit around the kitchen table till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning drinking shots of vodka. And they would tell me in hushed tones about their family experience with Stalin and the camps and who in their family was killed and who in their family was sent away. That little slice alone, try to get your American head around that.
I can't because it just seems like why don't they uprise and push against it? But you've said it's because it's all they know. It's
And they believe in the strong hand. They've always believed in the strong hand. You know, they looked at us in the 1990s when the Soviet Union started collapsing. People said to me, "Your democracy is like children playing with matches. We don't want what you have. We want what you have in terms of your cars and your clothes and everything else. We don't want your brand of government. It's too irresponsible and it's too undisciplined. And it's just a recipe for disaster." And you know what? In some ways, it's really hard to disagree with them. I mean, just look around what's going on right now.
yeah, oh, absolutely.
And historically, they like to have a strong figure at the top because number one, chaos means blood. And number two, they've been invaded for the last, 1,000 years. So they need protection. That's why they had all those countries. That's why they had all that territory. You know, why do we go invade Czechoslovakia and Poland and everything else? Because in their head, they're like, we better have some buffer around us because we keep getting screwed. We keep getting
Okay.
invaded by the Poles I mean, ancient history, right? The Poles and the Teutonic Knights out of Germany, and wave after wave, and the Mongols from the east. And historically, they're like, oh man, we gotta protect ourselves. And from an American perspective, it's totally not understandable. But if you put it in those terms, oh yeah, I guess it is understandable if that's what you experienced.
Okay, so taking that look at it, what I still struggle with is, do the people in the 80s and the 90s and even today see how the Russian mob, the Russian people in control in the government, who basically hold everybody else down and still have so much lack for the average person, that they're living these lifestyles of our wealthiest people, our billionaires that have these insane lives. There, there's no middle class, so to speak, from what we can see from the outside of the Russian, from what you talk about in your book. They're literally the haves and the have-nots, but the have-nots seem to have even less than anybody else, unless they're involved in the black market or whatever. And that's somehow even given with permission of these people who are wearing the jewels and going to these restaurants that aren't even hidden, and these palaces that they have that communism's supposed to get rid of. So I don't even know if this is the conversation to have in here, but you just have me thinking, Joe.
So,
I
so,
don't know anybody else to ask these questions of.
so here's the question: what are you going to do? What are you going
As a
to do?
Russian?
Yeah. What are you going to do? I was standing on a street corner across like 100 yards from the Kremlin. It was, I don't know, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. And this car comes screeching up. Four thugs get out of the car. They run over to another car where a man was just about to get in. They grab him, throw him in their car, and they speed off. Tons of people are watching this. What are you going to do? Question number one: do you want to die today? you know,
Okay.
do you want to get beaten up? There's an old man stepped off a curb, waiting for the light to turn red. He stepped off the curb enough steps, 2, 3 steps off the sidewalk, to make the oncoming BMW alter its path a little bit. And that driver was so put out by having to alter his path a little bit, he slammed on the brakes, got out of the car, and beat the shit out of the old man.
Really?
So now you tell me, this mentality, it's not like you can't find this mentality everywhere in the world. But the Russian mentality seems to be an extreme of everything else, right? We have mafia, we have corruption, we have organized crime, we have crazy people, we have all kinds of stuff. Over there, it seems so much more intense because of the weather, because of the drinking, because of the politics, because of the disparity in incomes, as you just said, because of the power of the person who has the money, the power of the gatekeeper. I can do anything I want to you. I have a friend who he was guilty of manslaughter. Okay. He didn't go to prison. He didn't even go to court. Why? Because he knew the prosecutor. Does that happen anywhere in the world? Sure. But in the Soviet Union, it just seems so much more intense because the whole mentality was like this. If you have a 9-year-old and my buddy says we get this with our mother's milk, and by the time you're a teenager, you're trying to figure out, should I join a gang, should I join the mafia, and you're just a normal teenager who was the 16-year-old son of a woman I was dating in Moscow. That was her worry. It's like, how do I protect my son? And they weren't thugs and they weren't gangsters, and they were just normal people who couldn't make ends meet. Because in 1992, 93, 94, 95, you walk into a supermarket, the shelves are empty. Now what are you going to do? And it's just this constant drumbeat. Let me throw one more overlay on it. In 1986, when I went over there as a tourist, our group went into a cemetery, in Petersburg, in Leningrad. And when you walk in the cemetery, that day it was very cold. There were speakers in the trees, piping in funereal music. And you
Okay.
walk through this cemetery, and they're just slabs of granite. And the only thing on these slabs of granite are the years: 1942, 1943, 1944. And 100,000 bombs drop on St. Petersburg, drop on Leningrad from the Germans. And you just walk through there, and I'm sure countless people walk through there, Leningraders walk through there saying, is my loved one under there? Just this mass grave of just profound suffering that we went through at the hands of outsiders. This makes for a psychology that's just different from ours. Does that make sense?
It does. My brain kept trying to link some different things, wondering if reading your book, talking to somebody like you who's been there and has different perspectives could perhaps help us understand some of what's happening here in America. And my show's listened to all around the world. And I want to thank Egypt for taking it up to number one recently. But we see these stories of gangs on the uprise here in the United States, in different cultural groups and different cities inside our country. Could some of this learning that you have, this perspectives, help us understand some of that and maybe shift it before it becomes so ingrained that mothers see more of their kids, who are currently now in some areas of major cities are saying gangs are our only way to survive. We don't have any other option. I don't know, Joe. I never thought about this stuff before because
Mm-hmm.
I've lived a privileged life here in America in a lot of ways. We were middle class. My family worked for everything they had really hard, but I went to a private Catholic girls' school. My parents figured out a way to get me there. I got scholarships to go to college, but a lot of people don't have that. And these stories you talk about in your book, which everybody needs to get, by the way, and I got my little card from Joe too. It makes me think of here where I live. I live in Florida. So as we all know, there's all sorts of craziness in Florida right now with politicians and stuff like that. Pandemics created a lot of that as well. I mean, how do you wrap your head around it and take those lessons, Joe, and use them in some way?
There are so many ways. I could write a book just off of your comments because there's so much there. There's so many things to talk about.
All right, cool. Go for it.
I'm just trying to figure out where to start. So the problem that we have, one of the many problems that we have, is that after 9/11, a lot of enforcement resources shifted to terrorism. Okay, so we got off the Russian track. Number two, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the Russian departments in universities wound down, right? So kids stopped being attracted to studying Russian, departments couldn't finance, have the budget, whatever. And so the infrastructure of your question is lacking. So how do we train people to understand other cultures? If I play this game in my head from time to time, if I were a king, if I were a dictator, what would I make my people do? And what I would make my people do is mandatory live overseas for at least a year when you're in high school, and you cannot go to Western Europe, right? You have to go to Cambodia, you have to go to Vietnam, you have to go to China, you have to go to Russia, you have to go to Kazakhstan, whatever, just to understand that the world is a different place than what we know it to be. Next thing is, Our social fabric is deteriorating partly because we're in that same struggle of how do we survive. For example, in Long Island, where we grew up, I have very little concept of how people survive there. I have very little concept of how people pay 10, 15, $20,000 a year just in property tax
Crazy,
and send their kids to school and put food on the table and have their insurance. And like, so you see what's happening here?
right?
Everything we just talked about for the last half hour. Where do you think we're heading? When you look at, uh, well, let me back up a second because you said, how do we do this before it becomes ingrained? Law enforcement tried in the 1970s and 80s. Grassroots, on the ground, boots on the ground law enforcement tried to tell their supervisors, we in the United States have a problem with Russian, Soviet, mafia, organized crime, whatever you want to call it. And the supervisors said, show me the structure. And the cop said, it's not structured like that. It's not five families, the Gambinos and the Colombos and all the rest of it. It's not like that. They're extremely fluid. They often work in cells. They often don't know each other. They're often small groups that have shifting relationships, and they're all about making money. So if we can help each other make money, great, we'll do it. And they made billions in the 1980s just off of gasoline tax skimming fraud.
Wow.
And they did insurance fraud, health insurance fraud, auto accidents, fake auto accidents, staged auto accidents. They run alcohol, vodka that's colored like Windex and brought into the United States through ports with fake bills of lading and all that stuff. Like anything you can imagine, they are adept at doing.
And it's
Any
still
shift,
happening even more now.
but here's the bigger issue. The bigger issue is a lot of these guys, the gangsters, right? The real gangsters, they, as quickly as possible in the 1990s, shifted to business so that the gangsters who were part of some of the biggest drug trafficking networks in the world also owned banks and companies and import export and were doing whatever they had to do to launder money and buying massive amounts of elite property in London, in Paris, in New York, and wherever else. And on the one hand, you can say, well, this is just what every culture does. The Chinese own tons of property, the Saudis, who owns American debt, and all the rest of it. But as we've seen over the last few years, I think the Russians are different. They're just a slightly different breed. If for no other reason than, yes, they did influence American politics. And yes, they did influence the White House. And yes, they do have close ties to top politicians in the United States. And here's the problem. And this is what, so all the things that we talked about and all the things we have in our book, what's the culmination? The culmination is that Russian state and Russian mafia are frequently impossible to pull apart in terms of who's who. And that there is no such thing as independent money in Russia. So if you get something like someone like Eric Trump or Donald Trump Jr. saying, oh, we don't need American banks, we get all the money we need from Russia. Oh, of course. I mean, there are a lot of wealthy people in Russia. There are a lot of billionaires. They want to invest too. And they've been investing in golf courses and everything else. And that's lovely, except there is no independent money in Russia. So if you think that the money, the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that have been flowing into Trump Tower and Trump golf courses and Trump whatever campaign probably, if you think that's just money by people who want to see him become president, think again. Because the top gangsters in Russia are and have been for a long time friends with Putin and friends with the hierarchy. And things like that don't happen without the most powerful forces at the top knowing about it. Whether it's the top gangsters influencing the government or the top government influencing the gangsters or the two of them strategizing together to to pull off what they want to pull off, this is not an accident.
Well, it sounds like nothing that you share in your book that we've talked about here today, the stories that really everything is crafted. And in order to survive for the average person in Russia and the stories that you talk about, it's all about their survival. How do you get the basic things? So, because we're getting close to the end of the show, Joe, I want to make sure that we cover how people can get your book and all that other stuff too. But to make this a topic that's not just a political one or anything like that, because there's so much we can unpack in many, many episodes, just talking about that last thing that you just talked about. I mean, when somebody's reading your book, when somebody is thinking about this episode, when they're listening at it, is there something they could take or think about their own lives, their own intersections in America, in Egypt, in Ireland, in Russia, where actually the show is kind of followed quite a bit, and several other places that you'd sort of like the takeaway to be for people, or one
Yes.
of the takeaways.
Yeah, one of the takeaways, first of all, I wanted to bring a little bit of clarity, at least from my perspective, on what Russia was and is. So I want people to look at it a little bit differently. And connected to that, number two is I would like people, I mean, I don't know if this is being frivolous. I want people to think a little more deeply. Part of the problem, and this is the basic premise of your show, right? It's all about the questions. So let's ask questions. And so when the media pops up spouting off about whatever, whether it's Fox or MSNBC or whoever, I don't care. The question is, how do you know that? How do you know that thing that you're reporting? What is it you're not telling us? What are your interests? What are you connected to? Who are you connected to? What money interests are you connected to? I want people to think a little bit more. And it's hard to do because we've been so sheltered from the world. I often say the two best things and the two worst things that happened to the United States are the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. It saved us from a lot of horror of European wars, and it isolated us from the rest of the world
Right.
so that we don't really know how the rest of the world functions. And we have to get outside of our simplistic, superficial, provincial thinking and question the sources of information around us a lot more.
And that's difficult for a lot of people, which is, as you said, why I created this show. It's all about the questions, because literally, and I say this at the end of every one of my shows, the right questions can change your life. If you don't ask the deeper questions, the uncomfortable questions, and keep pushing till you get answers, then we're going to be thinking that everything about our life is always the way it's going to be, good or bad. We're always going to be poor, or we're always going to be wealthy, when things can change on a dime, as we've seen when COVID hit, right?
Mm-hmm.
COVID's created more billionaires than any other time in history. It's fascinating. But if you don't ask the question, well, why did it? Where did those billionaires come from? What were the industries? Then you have other businesses where we've seen have all closed their doors because they couldn't pivot. I mean, look at Sears. They weren't asking the right questions along the way. They weren't seeing the reality in front of them. So thinking along that lines, Joe, I think that's brilliant. And I loved that your book made me think. And it made me think in ways I never thought about thinking before, and has me asking the questions like I asked you today, that you said you can write another book or something on, about, what's happening, what are the intersections here, and maybe how we can begin to shift things. And you would be a brilliant person, in my understanding of you, to maybe help America through a bunch of stuff that we're dealing with, and local communities to deal with it based on these perspectives you've had. But I digress, because I love you so much, and you just constantly, Joe, make me think.
Let
Ever
me,
since that first hug.
I know, I know we're winding down. Let me throw out this one last thing. In COVID, we watched people panic. We saw lines grow longer and longer. We saw toilet paper and God knows what else disappear from the shelves. And we went through that for a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks. Russians went through that for years at a time. I want to make sure I say this. There are a lot of amazing things about Russia. There are a lot of fantastic things about the Russian people. And there are a lot of things that the US is guilty of ourselves. So we can't paint this as they're bad, we're good. That's where the thinking comes in, and questioning what it is that we're seeing and what it is that we're reading and hearing and all the rest of it.
Yeah, because throughout your book, I've always had a fascination with the Russian people, reading their history and the stories, which history and stories tend to be one-sided or paint a picture or whatever. But I mean, Anna Karenina, Tolstoy, all of that other stuff. You reignited something where I want to meet some average Russian people, because the love, the passion, the joy they have for the littlest things is really powerful. So that really told me something. And that comes through in the book. So let's, before we end, make sure everybody knows how to get a copy of your book and to reach out to you if they have questions.
Yes, so autographed copy of the book at vodkahookers.com.
I love that.
And you can find me at joe@joeserio.com, info@vodkahookers.com, I think even joe@vodkahookers.com. So yeah, happy to talk, answer any questions. I got a letter from a Russian man the other day saying he loved the book and he was shocked and amazed at how right I got it. So that was a huge,
Wow.
kind of pat on the back. So that was a great thing to read.
Yeah, and when you're not writing books like this, you're training 911 operators and doing a lot of stuff with law enforcement and things.
Yeah, I'm a leadership and wellness trainer and speaker for government agencies.
Yeah, and certainly got the experience to do that, Joe. So one more time, people can find you at vodkahookers.com. They can get an autographed copy of the book. And your book is also for sale pretty much everywhere books are sold as well.
Yes, and we will be launching the audiobook in January.
Okay,
Audiobook in January, yes.
great. Is it available as an ebook
Yeah,
currently?
it's on Kindle. It's
Okay.
on Amazon as Kindle. We actually haven't put up the paperback yet, but that'll be going up in the next week or so.
Okay. Although I do love, and for those listening just on podcast, I keep holding up the book because the cover is, I just love, love, love the cover.
Just as a quick aside, that cover was designed by a Russian woman who lives in Moscow.
Well, I feel it. They say a lot of people choose a book by the cover. Well, it's really true, even on Amazon and all the ebook things, because you're scanning through unless you know the title of a book, which, by the way, Joe Serio's book is Vodka, Hookers, and the Russian Mafia, My Life in Moscow, for those that are just listening on podcasts. There's so much inside the covers of this book. So thank you for writing it, Joe, and for shifting my perspective on things.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Oh, always a pleasure. You're going to have to come back on again because I
Yes.
just love and adore you. Okay. All right, everybody. I want to thank Joe for being my guest on the show today. I hope he has shifted your thinking about a lot of things that you deal with on a daily basis. and got you just asking some different questions. Remember to reach out to him at vodkahookers.com. Grab a copy of his book, and out on social or via email to me, let me know what you're thinking after today's episode. It's a very different episode than what I normally talk about. We got into some politics. We got into the way the world works outside of what we here in the United States often think of as the world works. But we also know that a lot of what Joe talked about is happening here in the United States. It's happening all over the world. So I'd love to know what you think and what new questions you're learning to ask. At the end of the day, everybody, remember, the right questions can change your life. So what are you asking today? Have a great day, everyone.
You've been listening to It's All About the Questions, starring Laura Stewart. Connect with Laura at it'sallaboutthequestions.com and download a free workbook that will help you ask better questions starting today.